Thank you for joining us today and welcome to the 2021 U.S. Rowing Convention. This is the kickoff of our 2021 convention for coaching, education, and excellence. And we have a big one today. The first topic is multifaceted. It's a huge one and it applies to all of us. So it's a very relevant topic. And that is, how do you coach the modern athlete? How do you deal with the modern parents? And where does old school coaching and the new paradigm, where do they connect, and what do we have to do to be better? To get things started, though, we are going to name the Female Athlete of the Year for U.S. Rowing. And my boss, Sarah, is here to get that rolling. And so we want to say congratulations to Megan Miznicki, who is the U.S. Rowing Female Athlete of the Year. So Sarah, why don't we get that going?
Selected by the athletes and coaches of the team that competed at the Tokyo 2020 Olympic and Paralympic Games, the U.S. Rowing Female Athlete of the Year is Megan Miznicki. A 9-time national team member, 3-time Olympian, and 2-time Olympic gold medalist, Miznicki has been a stalwart in the women's 8 for 3 Olympic cycles. After taking some time away following the Rio Games, Miznicki came back in 2019 to help the U.S. 8 win bronze at the World Championships and qualify for the Olympics. Miznicki capped off her storied career in Tokyo, finishing 4th.
Hi, it's me, Megan, but most of you probably know me as Moose. It's pretty strange to accept this award virtually, but nevertheless, it doesn't diminish how humbled and honored I am to be here accepting the award for Female Athlete of the Year. I started training at the Princeton Training Center in 2008. I made my first team and every team thereafter from 2010 through 2016, and then, because I just couldn't get enough, I came back and made the team again in 2019, 20, and 21. Thanks, COVID. To say it was an amazing experience would be a huge understatement. What we do, or rather try to do, is not easy. Being an elite athlete, by definition, is hard. Brutally hard. There are good days and very bad days. But through it all, you have your teammates and your support system. And I would not be here talking to you today without them. All of them. Thank you to my mom and sister for always lending an ear when I needed it and supporting me even when you thought I was crazy to come back and do it again. To my now husband, thank you for dealing with all of the tears, the laughter, the mood swings, the highs, the lows, and everything in between. Thank you for supporting me when I decided just one more year. I love you. To my New Jersey family, the Clockenbrinks, you took me into your home and basically, I never left. Seriously, I was there for the better part of 10 years. They fed me, they housed me, they were there when I needed them to listen, and they were there to celebrate even the smallest of victories with me. They are no longer a host family, they're simply family. Thank you to Tom and Laurel for helping to set the bar high. Without a high bar, you don't fail, and without failure, you never learn, and consequently, you never realize how far you truly can go. To Mark, the man, the myth, the legendary PT, thank you. I'm due for another appointment here soon, I think. Thank you to the New York Athletic Club for your support of my training. I wear the winged foot with pride. And last, but most certainly not least, my teammates at the Princeton Training Center. Those that came before me, those that made the team, and the ones that just missed out. You are all incredible women. You showed me what it took to be great. You helped keep me going when it got tough, pushed me to be better, were there to support me on our tough days, and there to celebrate the victories when they happened. I'm pretty sure I'm out of time, but I want to reiterate how humbled I am to receive this award voted on by my peers. Thank you. Go Bombers.
Well, congratulations, Megan, from Ithaca College, huh? All right, so as as Megan alludes to, there's a support system for all of our athletes, right? And we're part of it. So we need to find a way to facilitate the journey for our athletes and make it as healthy a process as possible. And that paradigm is evolving. And we were talking earlier, it's evolving really fast. Social media, everything happens so fast. Everything hits the fire immediately. You get responses and reactions immediately. So how do we deal with the aspects of being a coach in sport nowadays when it has changed so quickly and so dramatically even in the last couple of years. So what we're going to talk about today is, let's start off with the obvious question. Like, what is the modern athlete, right? When we say the modern athlete, what does that mean? Kevin, what does it mean to you when we talk about the modern athlete?
Well, from my point of view, first of all, hello, everyone. Really glad to be a part of this.
Actually, you know what, Kevin? Let's start all over. Let's introduce everybody. I got so excited about the topic. That was a good subtle reminder, Kevin. Let's introduce everybody first. Kevin, you're on. You go first.
Hello, everyone. Really honored to be here. My name is Kevin Harris. I'm the head coach of the University of Tulsa, and I'm also a member of the DEI committee and a member of U.S. Rowing Board of Directors.
Jane?
Hi, I'm Jane Miller. I'm a retiree of 2 years from the University of Virginia, where I was a senior associate. I also served on a number of NCAA committees, including the NCAA Division I Board of Directors. And I've supervised, in my main role at the university when I was working, was supervising all of the Olympic sports.
Nick?
Yep. Hello, everyone. Nick Mcpartlin, Director of Athletics, Health, and Physical Education for the Saratoga Springs School District, a district located in upstate New York. Prior to my position here as the AD, I've been an AD in other local districts, but also started my career as a health and PE teacher and a coach across multiple sports. So really excited to be here. Thanks for having me.
Ted?
Hi, everyone. My name is Ted Benford. I'm the Executive Director of Community Rowing, which is a public access rowing organization in Boston. In my role as Executive Director, I oversee a number of initiatives here in one of the largest rowing organizations around the U.S. Prior to that, I was a collegiate coach at the Division III club, Division I lightweight, and Division I heavyweight level.
So we've assembled basically people who have done this at the collegiate level or doing it at the collegiate level. CRI is the biggest club in the country, maybe the world, and a high school. So we've got a lot of bases covered. And now, Kevin, now we're there, right? Let's define, let's just put it out there, what we are talking about when we're talking about the modern athlete.
Well, I think, the modern athlete is someone who's really empowered in the sport, right? It's someone who understands that it's not just about putting the oar in the water, that there's a lot of things around it that make getting to that point of where we can make boats fast and create speed. We've got to be able to take care of all the basic needs before we get to that place where that athlete can be successful and sort of self-realize success.
Ted, at CRI, you have 45 more, maybe more bits of programming. You serve the needs of so many different cross sections of our society. When you think about the modern athlete, what does it mean to you overseeing all of that?
So I think on the club level, and even in my experience with collegiate athletics, especially later in my career, even at the Division I level, one of the things we've evolved here is that CRI is a boat club for sure for many, but it's also an experience provider. And I think the context of providing people an experience means that we're not sort of what you alluded to in the beginning. It's not just about catch finish. A lot of people here don't remember whether we did a slide progression drill that went to 3/4 slide or half slide, but really how they were treated here and how they felt about being here. And that could be with relation to their own safety, them being recognized as people, them being recognized as athletes. We talk about different types of discrimination in the sport. And I think a big thing for us is the context for a lot of the leadership that happens here is around the experience of being here versus the competitive performance or even the quality of the rowing.
Jane, 35 years at Virginia. You came in the early 80s. You must have seen a really dramatic change in athletes and parents, but also in the coaches who were probably there when you entered, coaching as yourself at first, right? And then now looking back, nowadays there must have been a huge change in the 35 years. Like, what do you think of when you think of the modern athlete?
Well, the modern athlete is very different than when I was coaching. And it's better, I think, especially on the women's side. Our athletes are much better athletes. They're stronger, they're faster. They're more dedicated to have, I think, a full experience on the most part, not just with their sport. They're also involved in the community like they haven't been in as much perhaps when I was coaching back then. So much has changed. Their expectations have changed. I think parents' expectations of what they want their experience for their child to be at the college level. You know, all the things that they're dealing with as a student athlete, you know, the coaches have to deal with it, but the student athletes now deal with NIL. They're now dealing with individual branding. We know for good or bad, they're dealing with the transfer portal, whether or not to go in or to stay out. What does it mean if I go into that transfer portal? How do I use my social media to help me and not to hurt me? So none of those things existed when I was coaching. I have to say I was very lucky that I didn't have a lot of parental phone calls because that wasn't done back then. You know, I think my assistant coaches probably got the brunt of that more than anything, but I was fortunate with that. So I commend the coaches of today. I actually have no idea how they get everything done that they need to do and at the level they're expected to get it done. So congratulations to coaches that are working really hard to help our student athletes.
You know, that brings us into to the next part, right? You know, a lot of times you hear the phrase, I'm an old school coach, or, you know, that person is just an old school coach. And if you think about it, you know, you talk about when you started, Jane, you know, think about what the average coach nowadays is dealing with. And we were messing around, just throwing down some words on paper yesterday. And so you've got things like concussion protocols, safe sport in our sport, right? You have Simone Biles brought up mental health issues at the Olympics, at the Olympics when she was going to compete. And you're seeing that, and, you know, they were talking about one of the football players last night, you know, just taking some time off in season. You got helicopter parents, you've got lawsuits, you've got specialization at an earlier and earlier age, and it's getting earlier. So that's leading to burnout earlier and overuse injuries. You got social media, which Jane just mentioned. You've got crazy, you know, what can you do, what can you not do in communications? You've got transgender issues, diversity, equity, inclusion, you know, LGBTQ plus, live shooter drills. I remember Steve Hargis telling me for the first time in his life, he had to bring a live shooter skill, a live shooter drill to his campus. The pandemic, COVID has really, you know, put us on our heels. And then you have safety. We've had tragedies in our sport in the last couple of years. Nick, the high school, I mean, obviously the best high school in the United States, of course, I think that goes without saying. You have 70 plus programs across 3 seasons. All of those things that I just mentioned are on the plate of your coaches, and winning and losing isn't it anymore. How do you, you know, when you came in, you must have had some coaches that were leftovers from the previous administration. So how do you define an old school coach, and how do you deal with that?
Yeah, great question. And just to be a little more specific, we have about 87 teams across our 7th through 12th grade level. So we have about 135 coaches, including volunteer assistants. So there's a lot of adults here that are working with a lot of students. We have the biggest athletics department in the capital region. With regards to how many teams and how many offerings we have, which I wear that as a badge of honor. I think that's great, and I think there's even more room to grow. With that being said, it can be very difficult being able to connect and evaluate and assess coaches on a regular basis and get enough of a sample size to really know, hey, is this program or is this coach leading our department in the right direction? Are they kind of stagnant, or are they maybe pulling us in the wrong direction? You know, more often than not, and I won't say that every time, but when I get a coach that is throwing around the term, I'm an old school coach, it makes me cringe a little bit. Not to say that there isn't some old school qualities out there that I don't see as often in maybe new coaches, younger coaches. But more often than not, when a coach throws that out, I think they're trying to validate that they don't have any room for growth, or they are not currently seeking professional development, which I have a major issue with. When I have end of the season meetings, that is always a question of mine. Where are you trying to grow right now? How are you growing? And it's a wide open question. I mean, just not being able to share anything is a problem for me. I think it's unacceptable. And it's really, it's not tolerated. I need to know that you're reading something, that you're even watching YouTube videos. Just give me something that you're currently working on, and that you're being vulnerable to the idea that, hey, I'm not perfect right now, regardless of how many years that you've been coaching. So, you know, that attitude of I'm an old school coach is really problematic when you think about the modern day athlete. Really, it does not fit well when you think about the modern day athlete, which is such a loaded question, especially here at the interscholastic level, right? We're education-based athletics. So as you've mentioned multiple times, Chris, you know, winning is not the primary metric anymore. You know, do we want our student athletes to buy into the idea of winning 100%? Do we want our coaches to encourage our kids to understand what qualities and characteristics are required to be a winning program? 100%, right? Because that's the lessons that we hope they learn when they leave our program and go out into the real world, and hopefully can be successful contributing citizens in our communities. You know, but the modern athlete, I mean, you just look at the last 24 months, how much that's changed our athletes. And I can tell you, just in this short time during this school year, I've dealt with more conduct violations by our student athletes than I did probably my first year and a half when I got to Saratoga Springs. And in large part, I think what we're seeing is the unstructured time, the way schools are impacted by COVID, whether it was through remote education or hybrid models. I think it's rearing its head right now that teenagers that aren't pressured to manage their time well and are held accountable through their sport, through their seasons, through coaches, is going to create these idle times for the kids, and we're dealing with that right now. But no better place than in the sports world, I think, to get student athletes back on the rails and back on track. You know, so it's a part of our job, but again, it's going to be more and more challenging with coaches that continue to subscribe to this idea that they're an old school coach and that's just the way they're going to be. You know, I can tell you within our program, that's probably a good way to phase yourself out of Saratoga Springs athletics. But you know, it's my responsibility to, you know, shine the light on that and help them better understand why that's not acceptable. And you know, there's some qualities they can continue to hang on to, but they got to be open to areas that require improvement.
You know, I got to tell you, so we all met yesterday and talked a little bit. Nick, you weren't able to be there, but all three of the other people, you just said reading. And I think it's interesting that all of you in some way have talked about, as you're evaluating or looking at coaches, that reading was a big part of that. Like, what are you reading? What are you trying to do? And Colin, in the Q&A row, doesn't it mean an important requirement for a modern coach is to be a lifelong learner? So number one, if you have questions or thoughts, everybody, please do put them in the Q&A. And two, you know, if you're not a lifelong learner, then, you know, why are you coaching, right? It would be an interesting conversation to have for another day. You know, well over 100 coaches. Nick, Ted, you said that you have hired in the past year over 30 coaches. You have another 30 to 40 on staff. So when you're hiring, right, Kevin, you are a coach, but you hire your assistants. Jane, over the 35 years, you have seen plenty come and go. So when you're looking, like there's got to be essential skills, and there's got to be some commonalities across the board that you're all looking for. So when you're looking for coaches, what would you say are some of the essential skills that you hope that your coaches have? Now, Kevin, I'm going to start with you, because one of the things you brought up yesterday is the specificity of finding the right person for the right role on your team. So it's not necessarily, you know, this broad thing. You have some ideas in mind. So why don't you start off with what are some of the essential skills that you're looking for as examples?
All right, I appreciate that. So, you know, for us, it's about communication. I mean, really, a lot of what we're talking about here is about the ability to not only communicate clearly, but to also listen, right, and hear. And you know, when I'm looking for an assistant coach, what I'm looking for is someone who can not only communicate the skills and the things that we need, but can also hear the fact that sometimes being an assistant coach isn't about being a coach, right? Like being an assistant coach in a program is oftentimes about filling a role. And, you know, my staff, I think all of them are actually listening to this. So I appreciate you guys, and I love you very much. But, you know, we have to come to an understanding that, for instance, in a small program like ours, you know, the head coach is hired to coach, assistant coaches are hired to make the head coach's job easier. And there are many ways that we accomplish that, whether it's through working with the student athletes one-on-one or handling the day-to-day things that allow us to be successful. Like, you know, right now we're in an exam time. So our assistant coaches are available for the athletes if they want to do things outside of practices, because we're not practicing right now. You know, we have to be able to have people who have empathy. We have to have people who are willing, not only just me, but the assistant coaches have to be willing to learn and understand, right? And then, you know, for all of us, you know, I think in terms of, you know, sort of Colin's question, being a lifelong learner, it was the point at which I realized that I knew everything, that I understood that I didn't know anything, right? And getting to that point of saying, okay, every day is an opportunity to learn. Those are the kind of people that we're looking for. We're looking for people who understand that it's a we and not an I. So, you know, finding those people sometimes can be very difficult, because in our modern, you know, as we talk about being modern athletes, there's also modern coaches. There's a lot of sort of I statements that can go along with, you know, this is my boat. These are my athletes, right? When in reality, we're all trying to be successful together. And without sort of those other skills, we don't ever really get there.
Ted, so, you know, Kevin's got a rowing team, right? And he's hiring for his staff. You have 40-something programs. And, you know, they show up at the boathouse for different reasons. When you hire, you've also got to figure out how do they fit into the fabric of the boathouse, where there's 40-something other programs besides your own that you need to be looking for. So when you're looking for essential skills, do you have to expand the essential skills that you're looking for because of the sheer volume of ins and outs at your boathouse?
Oh, that's a good question. No, I think what Kevin said is actually just sort of on point. You know, one of the things about working at community rowing is the cooperation necessary and the intrinsic conflict and I'm not finding the right word, but the idea that if in order to succeed here, part of the success is the fact that coaches are interdependent. I need to get my equipment back to the boathouse on time, so a program and a coach and people that I have no idea who they are can get back into the equipment that I just used to be able to get going. So resource allocation and connection to how each of our staff simply contribute to the success of the organization just by doing the things that they've agreed to do. So, you know, we might get into this a little later, but the idea of how we onboard and how we all sort of create the selectors for people who are willing to, you know, connect to the greater purpose of the organization, even though what their role is just by doing their job, they're making a massive contribution to what we do. So I can't tell you what happens here if a coach takes the wrong set of oars or takes a boat that isn't allocated to them, and what the downstream effect of that is, not only on the experience of that coach and the staff that they impact by that, but also obviously all the rowers. And let's not forget that for the rowing organization people here, our rowers are our donors. So if the experience of our staff is diminished by other staff, and the experience of our rowers is diminished, intended or not, by people within the organization, that's an organizational challenge. That's an existential challenge to the entire enterprise, not just one coach being selfish or being untrained. Just one last thing that I think is, I just want to sort of put in here is the idea that for us, when we do look at who our coaches are, what we want not only is sort of the idea of continuous learning, but the approach that they're open-minded to accept hard truths or information. And Kevin referred to it a little bit. I want to reiterate that that they're willing to accept that even though they may have coached at the highest levels, when we ask them to coach a learn to row class, that they're willing to learn what the necessary steps are for that class, and that they're willing to say the name of every person in the boat. You know, that they're not talking again about themselves. Oh, I rode at the national championships and look at me, but my name's Ted. What's yours? That kind of connection and cooperation is essential to success.
Yeah, you know, it's Jane, you had used a couple words when we were talking about this. You talked about essential skills being empathy. You talked about integrity, and I believe humility. What is your feeling on essential skills? I mean, you've hired a few coaches in your time.
Yeah, I think there is, those are three words that are really important to me. And empathy is now becoming one of the main qualities that people look for when they're hiring. A study was done that shows that people that show empathy are 40% more likely to be successful in leadership skills. And some surveys show that empathy is the number one quality that good leaders or the best leaders show, that they're able to use that in their everyday work. Yeah, I think humility, you know, as we just, Ted just talked about, it's not about you, it's about your student athletes. So when I'm hiring, and when you're hiring, you're asking questions that give them the opportunity to show that student athletes are first. You know, you give them questions about, you know, how do you handle this? What are your most important things for your student athletes? You have to ask those kind of questions to sort of tease out where they land. I think, you know, a lot of people look at proven success, but nowadays that's only one facet, and sometimes a smaller facet, because everybody who's applying for your job should have certain qualifications. But you are looking for proven success, but you're also looking for solution-oriented people. You know, can they solve problems? Not someone who comes in and said, this isn't working, how are you going to fix it for me? It's, this isn't working, here are some of my suggestions how we can solve this problem, how we can move on and get better. So student-centered is really, really important. We care about the overall experience of our student athletes, and not just the fact that they're the number one quarterback in the state or whatever, and also caring about the last person on your squad. That is really, really important, that it doesn't stop at the top levels or your starting lineup. I guess
no
one
surprise.
of the bottom line questions I always ask myself is, would this person be a good colleague? Would this person be a good teammate? And you have to have a lot of conversation with them. You got to really tease out some things to get a feeling for how they might fit into your culture. They have to know what your culture is.
Agreed. Yeah, you know, in rowing, right, you're only as fast as the weakest person in the boat. So that kind of makes them the most important to your speed, doesn't it? You know, somebody asked the question, are you reading are we reading any books? And I'll say, talking about leadership here, think about this. I recently read the book Legacy about the All Blacks of New Zealand, and what a great book. And one of the things that they said in there was that great leaders don't make followers, great leaders make other leaders. You know, like, and I always thought that was really cool. And you know, Ted talking about, you know, knowing your place and doing your share. They have the chapter about sweeping out the bay. You know, where that's a big part of their culture is everybody sweeps out the bay. That's, you know, that's part of your responsibility and your connection is sweeping out the bay. And there's nobody too good, as Jane was saying, there's nobody too good to sweep the bay out. All right, so we've talked a little bit about essential skills. You know, the real trick, right? And Jane, you mentioned this yesterday, is that people can game the hiring process. They can game the system. They do they research on the person that's about to interview them. They have all these strategies on how to answer questions and so on and so forth. So when you're hiring, right? When you're hiring people, do you have strategies on how to find red flags? Do you have strategies on find a way to get to the character of a person, or to find out if their, you know, code of ethics matches up with your code of ethics? So, Kevin, I think you have the best strategies, right? You just let them talk. The more they talk, the easier it's going to be for you to figure it out. So just find a way to let them talk. You know, Nick, in your with your job, with over 80 something programs that have head coaches and assistant coaches and so on and so forth, you must interview a lot. What do you do when you approach an interview? How do you do it?
Yeah, great question. And unfortunately, with my position, I would say hamstrung a little bit by contractual language at times. When we have an opening, a vacancy, and it's put out there, there's teacher contract language that kind of favors our faculty here to have a first crack at a coaching position. And I can tell you, the perfect storm is when you have a really good teacher who's also a really good coach. I mean, it just helps strengthen the culture of that program. If there's somebody that can be seen regularly on campus, especially, if they're working with a high school team that they're housed in the high school, or if they're a modified coach and working at the middle school, it just makes things much more smooth. And regarding, being able to hold kids accountable, see them on a regular basis, continue to build on those student athlete relationships by just getting that additional repetition and time in front of those student athletes. So, I always get really excited if I have more than a handful of applicants for a coaching position. One of the things I've learned here is, we really got to push our vacancies out there, because we do want to have the best candidates come forward, so that we can fill a role. When I'm interviewing a coach, and I'm taking some notes here. This is great. Just listening to Jane talk about empathy, humility. How do you, what are you looking for when you interview a coach, and what things do you want to hear, and when does that shake out? And just looking back on some of our notes, I don't know if it was maybe Ted or Kevin who put that in our notes section, but when you hear I and me quite a bit in an interview, that becomes a red flag for me. That's a problem. Our coaches need to be using us, we, our. The only time they should be saying I or me is when there's a mistake. And they are taking extreme ownership for something that maybe didn't go correctly within their program. But one of the things I'm finding more and more as I interview coaches is, rather than asking them to talk about things related to empathy, humility, being student-centered, I want to hear more at the granular level. What does that look like in a practice? What does that look like in a pregame? What does that look like during a timeout, in a team huddle? And I don't know that coaches spend enough time thinking about that. They might tell you, yes, I show humility, I am empathetic, but they have a hard time talking about how that's built into their seasons, into their daily practice plans. And one example of that might be, and I appreciate, Kevin, earlier you mentioned, or I heard you say, I love my assistant coaches very much. It's amazing how few coaches feel comfortable telling their student athletes that they love them. I think at a minimum, our coaches should love at least a handful of the kids they're working with every single day. You're spending a lot of time with them. And I think there's a lot of value in coaches sharing that. Hey, I love you very much. I work with a student athlete leadership team here every other week, and I'll throw that on them every once in a while. Just sometimes I like to see, how it knocks them on their heels a little bit. They're not used to hearing the L word from someone that is outside of their family. And obviously, if you're going to say it, you should mean it. I would never encourage coaches to just throw that around flippantly, but that's being empathetic, is showing that you truly care for someone. I also think that, coaches willing to take ownership in front of their team, and it's okay to make mistakes as coaches. Like, our coaches should be working hard and taking challenges to better their program. And sometimes things aren't going to work out. I mean, we push our kids every single day to show up to practice, to work hard in practice, to take chances. And it's okay to take chances and maybe make mistakes. But I think sometimes coaches too aren't willing to demonstrate vulnerability in front of their team. So when I'm interviewing coaches, I like to drill down in those areas. Okay, don't tell me you're empathetic. How would I know you're empathetic if I showed up at a practice or a game? Give me an example where you demonstrated empathy in front of your program or your group of student athletes. So, you can Google search all day, great interview questions, and the same things are going to come up. But I think really drilling down to what you're looking for and diving deep into some of those, those human characteristics are really important. And that's what I'm looking to hear. Is this person really serious about working with our student athletes? And is this someone I think will really care for our kids right away? Or am I just getting clinic talk and kind of superficial responses?
Jane, you said an early red flag for you was somebody who just might embellish their resume just a bit, or overemphasize, some meaningless stuff just to, to put all that filler in the resume. Did you see a lot of, crazy resumes come across where people were, where you found, Kevin, you mentioned honesty yesterday. Like, how many times have you caught people just maybe embellishing their resume a little bit, which was borderline dishonest? Did you come across that a lot, Jane?
Did I?
Yeah.
I can't say I came across it a lot, but I think you find that out, but when they use I a lot. I mean, I think that's just a critical word. And how they answered, I love what Nick's saying about drilling down and getting to the specifics. It's the questions that you ask them specifically. And then on their resume, I always refer to 1, 2, or 3 of the things they have on their resume and ask them very specific questions about what that role meant. What are the specific things they did in that role? Who were they working with when they, when they did that, or when they were at that particular school? So I can't say I saw a lot of over embellishment, but the one thing that I think you might be referring to a little bit is when they over compliment you as the interviewer. They know so much about you that every opportunity they're telling you something about, man, I knew you did this. What a great thing. And I can't believe you won that award or whatever. People do that. And it's like, stop now. This isn't about me. This is about you. And I want to know more about what you've done. So the embellishment, I think sometimes, and I saw that a lot when people were trying to be prepared and show that they knew their stuff by over complimenting the interviewer.
I would add also just a quick thing, and that is that this is a brutal hiring environment. And so there's oftentimes a lot of enthusiasm to hire somebody. I saw something in the chat about it's tough to find coaches in DC. It's tough to find coaches everywhere.
Yeah.
And when we're talking about the right coaches, that pool goes from a already pretty narrow pool to an even narrower pool. And I think when we're talking about hiring to a cultural fit versus a skill-based fit, and an organizational match fit, I think one thing Nick just sort of mentioned that we're looking at very deeply is how do we recruit the appropriate coaches, and where does that come from? And I think a lot of it comes from within our community. So our alumni and people, I think each of us have a different cohort that we could probably draw from, but it never strays from what Jane just said. Right. So even though we might already have a very, very finite pool, you might be selecting from maybe 1 or 2 people as opposed to your comfort zone of 5 or 6. And so the questions become even more important around really narrowing. One thing is that the hiring, sort of group always wants to make sure that they have enough people to feel comfortable that they're going to get the right person. But sometimes, from our perspective, we have had a couple national searches that have yielded very, very few candidates from our comfort level. And a big part of that is just making sure that the questions we ask about this small pool of candidates is appropriate. And I think we can talk about recruiting people in a different set, but nothing changes when you have a very small group of people that you're talking to.
Well, Ted, to even take that further, there was a point in the fall where there were over 200 rowing coaching opportunities, and there just weren't 200 people out there looking for them, right? So, how many times does a program look at it like, the lesser of evils, like you had 2 people apply or worse, you had 1, do you promote from within? Do you say, well, fine, I'm going to teach somebody to be a coach rather than take my chances with somebody who, may or may not be impressive in interview or on paper? And how many times do you have to look at it like, in order for my program to exist or grow or to thrive in its current size, I need bodies in here. Like, at what point are you you're just getting a body in, right? And so there's a danger there too, is there not? Okay, so let's talk a little bit about coaches then. So you've hired your coaches, you found, for better or for worse, the person that best fills out your description of what you want. Let's talk expectations. Each of you has been in a position where you've had to create and express the expectations that your coaches have upon them. whether they're board driven or, university driven or whatnot, school driven, school board. How do you create your expectations? How do you let the coaches know what is expected? So Nick, why don't we start with you? Like, massive staff, right? You probably have some generalities. Where do you begin with your coaches in terms of letting them know what's expected?
Yeah, so we have the more official general certification. So for example, if I have a non-teacher coach, they have to go through a series of requirements to get a temporary coaching license, and it takes about 4 to 5 years before you get your permanent coaching license, which I think is a little bit more rigorous than maybe most other states, but it's a good thing because it kind of shakes out some of the people that aren't really interested in. They like the idea of being coached. They love the idea of maybe getting that free Booster Club sweatshirt that says coach across the chest, but not so much to go through 10 to 15 hours of training just to set them up for that first year of coaching. So that kind of trims some of the fat a little bit. But after we get through that, and we get our certified coaches, or we get our in-house teacher who doesn't have to go through some of those same requirements because of what they have to do as a certified teacher, we have steps that take place every season. They get a coach's handbook. We have a preseason coaches meeting, and we kind of rehash what the yearly expectations are. But as you mentioned, Chris, our staff is really big, and I'm now in my third year here, where the relationships are starting to be built with the coaches, and the challenging part with my job is really having to kind of move away from the coaches that I know are just doing a really good job. I've seen them enough. I've been around enough. I've had enough conversations about kids where I just have to trust that day in and day out, they're doing a great job with their program, and I just got to continue to support them, which is always a challenge because in my position, I want to be able to help them continue to grow and continue to stretch them and challenge them and lean on them. But the reality is, I as much as I like being around those high flying coaches, I have to spend more time with the coaches that are either brand new and they need some mentoring from me, or the coaches that are just clearly not meeting the mark and the expectation. So making myself available to coaches, frequently attending practices and games. And again, it is a challenge because we're spread across the district. Not all of our sporting events happen on one campus. We have to utilize community centers, facilities. For example, a local, Skidmore College is where we swim. It's only 8 minutes away from the high school, but sometimes getting 8 minutes away from the high school when you got 100 things going on at the high school can always be a challenge, but I need to be there. I got to be present. The student athletes need to see that I'm there, but more importantly, our coaches need to know that I'm there. And, those are, just small samples of observations, and you're not gonna learn everything about a program and a coach just in, sitting in on one practice or one game. So it's finding the repetition with each of the coaches, so we have our basic level expectations here as a district, where our human resources have to put coaches through, a fingerprinting process, again, making sure they have their coaching certification. They have to be Board of Education approved, appointed by our Board of Education. So we have those formalities in place. And then from there, it's really just the one-on-one connection that I make with the coaches and having those regular conversations, giving them feedback, and then finding ways to get feedback from the people that are connected to our programs, whether it's assistant coaches, the athletes, or the parents. So it is a daunting task. 135 coaches, one athletic director. I have not figured out the perfect system. I will be completely honest, but I'm getting more and more comfortable. As we retain coaches, I know which coaches I don't need to connect with on a regular basis, and it allows me to narrow my focus a bit.
Sorry, guys. Jane, did you have a lot of meetings with your coaches when that was your role? Did you meet with them individually a lot? Did you have specific talks on expectations? How did it work at University of Virginia?
I think one of the most important things you do as an administrator is you have to develop relationships with your coaches. So I spent a lot of time just dropping in to see coaches. I attended all the games of the sports that I supervised. So I only had 6 sports by the time I finished. I used to do all but 2. So I would attend a lot of games. I would make sure I was always visible at the games to the student athletes as well as to the coaches. And then we would meet individually at least once a month. And then we would have all coaches' staff meetings at least once a month as well. But at the college level, the expectations really, I mean, they do start in the interviewing process, but then they also start with the contracts. So within their contracts, a number of expectations about how they conduct themselves are put into their academic expectations. There are things in those contracts nowadays at the college level that never would have even asked way back when I was coaching, but the contracts are pretty specific about expectations. And then we also have a head coach's manual where the very first page is a list of about 25 expectations. And they're as simple as being on time to meetings, to reminders about following up with parents within 24 hours if they get a phone call, just very simple reminders of things that happen in their day-to-day lives. So the expectations are really set early on. They're talked a lot about, and then certainly through the interview, the evaluation process. You know, we would talk about meeting the expectation. Did they meet them, and how did they meet them? So it's always a constant conversation about what's expected of our coaches in a very specific way, and then as a general way to a bigger coaching staff.
You know, it's interesting. Over the years, I think I've seen more coaches let go because the expectation was winning. They might be great people, but they didn't win and they were let go. I think I've seen more of that happen than poor human beings who won a lot. As long as they kept winning, they kept coaching. And so it's an instant real, like we're talking about, we're saying all the right things here, right? I mean, we're having this conversation, the 5 of us and 140 people are listening to us say this, and yet more people get fired for being a good person who doesn't win than being a bad person who wins all the time. So there's an irony there. Kevin, it is sad, right? I mean, and even all of us who are well-meaning get caught up in it because winning's exciting, right? You know, there's a question in here, Kevin. I wonder if you could help me out with the life of an assistant coach at college isn't exactly luxurious, right? I think we can agree on that. And so there's often, here's the question. There's often, I know, right? There's often a disjoint between coaching need and an organization's ability to pay a living wage. This means that an organization may hire who they can afford rather than who is best for the job. What is more important to teach? New hires, important to teach new hires to their ultimate success. Your expectations as a head coach, improving their coaching skills, or about culture. You have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, I mean, all of them are important is what I would say. I think the last piece is probably the most important, is the culture. You know, as a director, as an athletic director, or as a club director, as is Ted, executive director, you know, we all have to create a culture within our program that is supportive for the coaches who then need to go out and support that modern athlete, right? And the way that, you know, this is especially close to home for me because, you know, I've been pushing very hard here at the University of Tulsa to bring our salaries to a point of where our coaches can live and be happy within this environment, because, you know, it's not like being a football coach or a basketball coach where, you know, basically in a way they're catered to and there are more opportunities and, you know, there's a way to shine individually within a rowing staff that just doesn't exist, right? And what we want are people who want to buy into the culture that we have. You know, for instance, our team motto here is one team, one goal, one family. And I see it very clearly as my job to hopefully bring in people who want to ascribe to that, but then who are going to not only improve that, but improve that in a way that makes them, you know, really people who are other people want to hire. You know, Ted wants to give me a call and hire my assistant coaches. You know, you working for US Rowing, you want to bring our coaches onto the national team staff, or, you know, whatever that next step may be. You know, I recognize that I want to keep my staff because I've got a great staff, but I also recognize that part of my job is to make sure that when it's their time, that they're ready to leave this place and they're going to go off and help more of those modern athletes be great people. You know, another way that we talk about it here is purpose, mission, and goal, right? We want our coaches to be able to bring in, our purpose for the team is to bring in great students to this university. And then our mission is to educate those students. Our sport is meant to enhance their education. It's not meant to take the place of it. It's not meant to be something other, right? It's meant to be a tactile representation of what they're learning in the academic side. And then our goal is to win, but it's not just to win races, right? Like that's an all-encompassing goal. And what we know here is that if as head coach, assistant coaches, and athletes, we take all of those things on, then we'll take care of our modern athletes in a way that allows them to self-actualize and to be successful no matter whatever else is going on, because we're taking care of all of those things. And then I have the privilege of watching great coaches go off and be better coaches than, quite frankly, I think that I am.
I think that's Kevin. I got a huge whiff of that yesterday when I started off with how you been, and you were telling me how you were just making sure that your student athletes were focused on their exams. You weren't the coach like focused on, did you get your workout in? Did you get your run in? You know, like you were making sure they were focused on their exams. And so that I think that just goes right in line with your character. Last question on expectations on coaching, then we'll move on. We're doing great on time. I want to leave time for questions as well at the end. When and if and when do you find resources for your coaches to help them grow outside of maybe just the mission, right? Just the mission of, like Kevin, you're talking about, you know, on the water, we're a coach or an athlete. Our goal is to win races. I'll give you an example. U.S. rowing, all the staff went through implicit bias training in the last couple of weeks. You know, a lot of DE&I stuff, a lot of sensitivity training and training toward learning more towards, you know, all the issues that have been engulfing America in the last couple of years. So we are actively, you know, trying to improve each of us. Do you buy them books or, you know, like Legacy or whatever, right? Or do you send them? Kevin, I know that you know, one of your coaches just applied for level 3. And, you know, honestly, we don't see a lot of college coaches like beating down the doors to get certification unless they have to. Do you all find it important to sort of point your coaches towards any specific kinds of training? Or, you know, Nick, you might find a coach that's great at this, but really not so great at conversing with parents or with adults or something. Do any of you, and this is and we didn't script this question, do you spend your time trying to find resources or expecting them to supplement their skill sets or knowledge with any kind of outside resources or training? Ted?
Well, I think one of the things, going back to both the concept of assistant coaches as well as sort of the modern athlete, I think there's a definition of a modern coach that we want to sort of address very briefly here. And before I get there, Kevin, having coached with you in the early 90s, I can assure everyone here that you're a hell of a damn good coach. So if you've gotten better since then, I can only imagine what the experience of your athletes is. So congratulations on an amazing career. No, I think the idea around development of coaches is a priority, right? Because if we're going to expect them to be the types of people that we want to embody our mission and our values and our strategic plan, you know, our who we are as an organization, the only path forward is to look at that more as an investment than anything else. And for us, you know, and I think for the rowing organizations on the call here, we are oftentimes pass through. You know, coaches are on their way on their professional journey towards other objectives. Some coaches aspire to be longtime high school coaches, or they found a good balance between what Nick talks about with teaching, and, you know, they found their level where they're very, very successful and very happy. In my experience here at CRI and in other rowing organizations, and my own career path, one of the things that I did was cut my teeth at the club level and try to find pathways to learn. taking notes, listening to coaches, going to camps and taking notes on senior coaches. With the current state of affairs, I think the only way to create the type of workforce that CRI needs to create is to make a massive and explicit commitment to the professional development of our staff. So we're doing that at a couple different levels. Everything from management training for our head coaches and our young managers, who oftentimes is their first management job, to supporting all kinds of opportunities for professional development that oftentimes coaches are reluctant to take. And so a big part of what we're trying to solve to is, how do we know that coaching advancement is part of their goal. We know that professional development is something that we want to offer. And yet when we lead them to the opportunities, that they sometimes are reluctant. And that messaging and that connection between intrinsic interest and extrinsic sort of forces to get them to do the things that we know are going to advance their career is a balance here. But it begins with thinking about this as investment versus expense at the club level, for sure.
You know, Ted, I 100% agree. It's been put in here in the chat, and I'll read it just so I don't misquote it. We've seen a great increase in recognizing and addressing athlete mental health. What is the panel's perspective on coach mental health? The pandemic burdens of social media, life-work balance, general societal challenges continue to ratchet up the pressures as a coach, and how do we address this? And I think that's really was the purpose of this talk, right? Just to start, I mean, it's a starting point. In my role and my peers in U.S. rowing, I think, we agonized over what kind of convention did we want to have. Did we want to talk about rigging and training and, the meat and potatoes of our coaching profession, right? Or did we want to talk about, trauma-influenced coaching, DE&I initiatives, and mental health and well-being? And you'll see that this convention is loaded with those topics, right? And I think, Ted, you're right. You wouldn't normally take those choices, right? If you could go hang out with Klezhnev and talk rigging, or if you took some of these other topics, what would you choose, right? The sexy ones to talk about rigging, right? And you say, oh, I'm going to do that at the boathouse. Whereas, whether unbeknownst to all of us, every day we're dealing with mental health, whether it's us, the kids, the parents, whether it's talking about work-life balances and going home. Rowing's kind of an addiction, right? We'll spend as much time as we can on that water or in that bay. So it's an interesting topic to start to delve into when you start looking at other resources and professional development. It's not just a certification in technique or training methodology. I think there's so much more to the modern coach. We started off talking about the modern athlete. I think, Mike, I'm assuming that's you from Greenwich. The modern coach is so much more complicated. And, so long story short, we are looking at offering all these options to learn more and be more as a coach. Here's a question. Let's say a club comes to you for advice that may have been put together, but that may be able to put together a group of coaches, but hasn't set up the infrastructure for coach growth. Do well-organized teams with coach growth plan share their process, documents, or other details? What would you suggest to be the first steps for those smaller clubs that want to grow their coaching staff quickly in the best way possible? If you guys don't mind, I'll start this one. We are actually starting a small club Saturday this winter. And what we intend to do is talk about things that we have years past talked about, business of rowing, right? Gather a lot of people who are facing the same issues and challenges, and get everybody to share resources and to share experiences to help each other grow maybe a little quicker, make some shortcuts. The other question I would say to that is, my experience with starting Saratoga in '96 was I could call any rowing team and they would have helped me. I think that is, it's not a statement about any other sport. In rowing, it was amazing that anybody would help me about rowing. If, like when I was a wrestler, if I went to my opponent and said, hey, I forgot my sneakers, can I use yours for the next match? He would have laughed at me. But if I go over to Kevin and say, Kevin, I need that $50,000 8, would you loan it to me next race? He would look at the schedule and say, well, we're not using it, sure. Just make sure the rigging's back the way it was. It's an amazing sport. So in terms of the person who wrote that, and I'm sorry I didn't look quick enough to see who wrote it, you could reach out to virtually anybody in rowing You could call Ted, email Ted. Matter of fact, I'll give everybody Ted's personal cell phone number. You can call him. I'm kidding, Ted. But you know, and he would help. I mean, that's just the nature of our sport, I think, and it's a great part of our sport. Well, let's get through the last bit of this, and then we can take questions. Ted just put his email in there, so you know, let the floodgates open because he's not busy enough.
Well, I just want to be clear about that. I think that's important because I don't want to blow through that. I think the reason I did that is because so much of what happens is that there's this ceiling of where people want to reach out to. And, you know, I don't want to volunteer Nick or Jane necessarily, but from the standpoint of there's so much open source material that I think most organizations are willing to share. You know, just a quick example. I went to the US Rowing Convention, I don't know, 96, 98, 94, whenever, and I got Corzo's speed chart. And I got it from somebody who was just like, hey, do you want a copy of Corzo's speed chart? And I was like, oh my God, yes. That is going to be the path for me to be able to discover how to win the college collegiate world championships, right? Like I am going to dominate the world. And I got that spreadsheet with all the numbers and I mutated it perversely to fit my needs with the people that the speed of the athletes that I was coaching. All I needed was the worksheet to then take the next step as a coach. It didn't help me win a single sort of like major race. It changed the training. It changed my thinking. It showed me the depth of knowledge that I needed in order to make changes to my training schedule and to what I need to do. But, you know, at least I know Kevin and Chris have been on calls with US Rowing. I'm perfectly willing to share what I can with people. There's no state secret. It's also not going to, and just to be clear, it's also not going to be the thing that gets you over the finish line. All of this requires an enormous amount of work. Many of the organizations that ask for this information are volunteer-led organizations. And they think that because they're volunteer-led, they don't have the resources to necessarily take the steps that they're taking. Just simply by asking the questions and taking a single step is the process. It is the work that needs to get done that will advance either a club or a coach or a club looking for information about DEI efforts or coach development or how to buy boats or whatever it is. So, you know, the floodgate's fine, but you know, I'm happy to share, but I think the answers will ultimately sort of circle back around. I just wanted to share that anecdote. So.
Great. Let's talk a little bit about evaluating the coaches at the, you know, periodically. And then we'll move on to the most exciting part, and that is dealing with parents and communications. So evaluating your coaches. Jane, did you have a process where at the end of every season you would have an evaluation?
We had a yearly evaluation of everybody on our staff. And over the years, it evolved from a simple to a more complex evaluation system like Ted has. I have to say my bias with dealing specifically with coaches is that it doesn't have to be rocket science. I like a simple evaluation process personally, where you sit down, you match the expectations, the goals that they set with their performance, and that's in all areas, whether it's academic, whether it's community service, you know, their performance as a team. So I believe I like to write a summary of all those things, have a one-on-one conversation with them. And then I think what's important to coaches in particular, because I found that coaches at my level were very hesitant to have an evaluation system with a number system, because they all wanted to be rated at the highest level and they all thought they should be rated at the highest level. And if you put them at a 3, which means that they're doing their job, it's not good for them. It doesn't resonate with them. They think that they're just average when they believe that they're more than average. But a system sometimes locks you into an evaluation of them that really doesn't portray what they've done. So I'm one who likes to have a summary at the end. The summary includes information from exit interviews, and exit interviews done with each team. Those you have to be careful how you evaluate. It depends upon how many of the student athletes on a team participate in the exit interview. You need to know what the culture, have a little background about how the culture of the team is going. Is it a team that's a little bit more disgruntled? Or is it a team that doesn't bother to give you any exit interviews because everything's just going on great? So you have to use exit interviews, and they're important to find out if there are any red flags in particular, but just to make sure that you get a little bit more sense of what's happening for individuals. And then we do the yearly evaluations where we meet with the head coach. They have to set goals. And as I said, we talk about matching their performance with their expectations in all facets of their program. They like to see the specific data about what happened in their program, how many wins and losses, how they did in the conference level. They like to see that they had 15 of their student athletes made ACC academic team. They like to see that their team, and we like to see that their team participated in 2 community service projects, 1 in each semester. So they like to see the data of everything that they've done to show a true picture of their program for a year. So I like to combine the conversation, the exit interviews, and the goal setting into one final evaluation at the end of each year. For complicated ones, sometimes they really are difficult for coaches at the high collegiate level to put a lot of thought into and a lot of time into it. They're just so busy.
Jane, question about your exit interviews. Do you mean at the end of each season, or do you mean as athletes are leaving the team?
We do it at the end of each season because that's when they're most apt to reflect or participate in what their experience was. And it's a random selection of a number of student athletes for each team, but the opportunity for anybody who wasn't selected can request an exit interview. And those exit interviews are done by the supervisor of the sport. So there's 2 pieces to it. There's 2 pieces to it. There's a written piece that's very confidential that they sit in a room by themselves and fill out and put in an envelope. Then you put it in a pile. And then there's one where there's a certain number of questions that the student athletes all answer the same questions.
One of a very interesting thing I think you brought up is the expectations of the coaches in these interviews, right? Or in these evaluations. Isn't it ironic, I think, to sometimes to see what the coaches are feeling and what their expectations were, and they're coaching, kids or younger athletes. I wonder how much of that also is leadership on our part, right? The people from the top down, to create a culture where feedback is, you're looking forward to feedback. You're not threatened by it. Like when we're doing an evaluation of you, you don't walk into the office defensive, right? What kind of culture have we created that a coach can come in and take the feedback and say, you're right, you know what, I can be better. Instead of being, well, that was just one parent that was mad, like they're not going to fight you on it, right? Nick, do you get a lot of pushback when you're trying to evaluate the coaches? Do they have expectations that you should be taking their record more than the experience that they're offering the kids?
Yeah, so we have, and I can tell you, evaluating coaches is an area, at least in the education world, that I don't think has been figured out. And I really can't speak to the collegiate level. It is probably the biggest issue I have in my position is that I do not have a great system for evaluating coaches, and I'm very frustrated by it because it's hard for me to set higher expectations with coaches if we don't have a great system on how to gather feedback and relay that at the end of the season. So as I've shared earlier, with 135 coaches, it's impossible for me to meet with all our coaches, and I don't. But I do meet with all of our varsity head coaches, and I do lean on them to share back on how their assistant coaches or sub-varsity level coaches are performing within their program. And even that's challenging for them to speak on that if they don't get to connect with some of the sub-varsity coaches on a regular basis because, that team is practicing or playing, 10 minutes across town. So we have a self-evaluation tool, which I've inherited. It's still in place just because I haven't been able to introduce something new. And, full disclosure, a lot of that has to do with the fact that, well, I haven't even been here 3 years, and I haven't been here for a single year where COVID hasn't been a thing. So that's interrupted some of system building for me, and really fully evaluating some of the existing systems that I inherited, and just finding out how I want to tweak them. I mean, anyone in this room knows you don't come in and just slash and burn style start busting up things that have kind of been a norm here, even if you don't agree with it or love it. So that's been on delay, but that is where I have regular conversations with colleagues that are athletic administrators, whether it's within our section, across the state. This will be the first year in 4 years that I'm not going to the National Athletic Administrators Association, and that is where I tend to really tug on people's ears and hear what other states are doing when it comes to coaching evaluation. At the end of the day, it all comes back to having more time, and that's what I'm finding right now. My department isn't structured well enough to be able to fully evaluate all of our coaches. However, I think it's very important, and it's good practice that, after a varsity season where we know so much goes into that season, things leading up to the season, off season, I think it's important that our coaches know that I'm available to them. And I do want to hear about how their season went, what their thoughts were. Did they meet their goals? What are their needs from me? How can me in my position or our department better support them to meet their goals? So we're still working on what that process looks like. One thing I did introduce this year, and we're in the middle of it right now. We're about 3 weeks in, is introducing or allowing seniors or scheduling seniors to be a part of an exit interview process. Okay, and this is something I picked up from ADs that I'm connected with at the collegiate level, and hearing from Jane, it sounds like this isn't uncommon anywhere at the collegiate level, but it is uncommon, I think, at the high school level. I think maybe some athletic administrators are a little reluctant to creating a space where student athletes are basically strongly encouraged to provide feedback on their experience within a program. So right now, this is a little bit of a pilot year for us. We're only using our seniors. The reason being is I don't want underclassmen to feel pressure to provide some feedback on things that they feel like might come back to them. So I'm working hard to build the trust even with our seniors, the ones that are no longer going to compete in this program. But these same students might be a student of a coach who's also a teacher in the district, right? And they're a little reluctant. They're worried that, well, I really want to be honest and share my experience about a program and offer up suggestions for improvement, but I don't want it to get back to the coach. And, so right now it's a lengthy process for us because I'm connecting with all of our senior student athletes and explaining to them and really expressing the importance of these exit interviews and how we're using them as an athletic department, and how we are, making sure they feel comfortable understanding that this isn't an anonymous survey. This is not, sharing, the names of student athletes, with the feedback back to the coach. In fact, I've told coaches that if they're not interested in getting the feedback, that's fine. I'm using it as feedback for myself for me to improve the department. I'm looking for trends, and that's how I explained it to the coaches and to the seniors. If I got 10 seniors on a team and 9 of the 10 seniors gave glowing remarks about their experience in a program, that means something. That's not to say we're going to throw out the one outlier there. We're going to read into it and do the best we can to use our professional judgment and experience to better understand why did that one student seem to have a negative experience. And the student athletes, because they're not well practiced writers, they're not really good at hiding their true feelings. They lay it all out there. So if they had a bad experience because they didn't get a whole lot of playing time, that's a little bit different than 4 or 5 seniors that had a poor experience because they felt like the coach was abusive at times. So really looking for trends, and some of these trends might not show up for 2 or 3 seasons. So it's a new process. It takes some time. I think it's the right thing to do. Most of the coaches have been really optimistic about going this route, and at the end of the day, your really good coaches, I think, should already be doing this internally. They should be building some form of system for getting feedback from their athletes before they leave their program, if they're truly interested in getting better, and they're comfortable with being vulnerable. It is a good practice. So that's we're in the middle of it right now, and I'll be honest, I'm excited when I get the feedback from the student athletes so far. I mean, there's things that are showing up that I didn't even consider. And it has nothing to do with a coach. It has everything to do with, just the way their program is perceived within the school community and how can we improve on that. So that's been exciting because I feel like it's been an area that is really generating true, hard, tangible feedback versus a coach doing a self-evaluation where they give themselves glowing remarks, because even though they might not believe it, they don't want to risk, admitting to being maybe negligent in an area, and that might, show up poorly on their, within their file, so to speak. So it's an area of concern for me here, and I'm all ears, and I do plan to reach out to Jane, Kevin, and Ted, and after this session at some point, just to hear what their thoughts are and any tools that they have out there, because I don't think that you're ever done really thinking about how to better evaluate your coaches.
Well, I think what we're going to have to do is have a reunion webinar in February on evaluation, because we're getting a lot of questions on this as well. I'll tell you, one of the coaches wrote in the chat something that was interesting. She said, our athletic department recently used the 1 to 5 scale on evaluations to determine whether or not whether you get merit, in parentheses, additional money or not. All of a sudden, the meets expectations versus exceeds expectations or outstanding meant a lot more in every category. True, right? I mean, like you got these things and you're either one or the other. There's not like a storyline. So she's right about that. And Sarah, you wrote in here, great theme, important topic. I think, this is kind of a topic that we could, continue over the year. Like, this is probably one of those things where we could have a series of talks. Ted, you're on every Friday, right? We do the executive director's call on every other Friday. Let's move on to the next topic, guys, and finish this up. Dealing with parents and communications. Parents, as everybody knows, are much more interactive. And, the good old days of rowing, when I started Saratoga, when parents didn't know a thing about rowing, and now everybody's Google MD, right? They know. I talked to a coach and you're doing it wrong. And, how do you deal with that? Where do you draw the lines? At a collegiate level, Jane, you mentioned that it was different when you started in the 80s and then towards the end of the 35 years. What were some of the differences that you saw in parents, and how did you deal with it?
Well, when I was coaching, I just building relationships, I think, is just really important, as it is with anything. Parents are an important part of the program. So you tried to involve them where it was appropriate, but they also were less likely to go to me to voice concerns. They were more likely to go to my assistant coaches and get their concerns to me through that. Nowadays, the parents, there are parents who will call the president before they even call the coach. So you have varying levels. Some will call the coach right away, and that's what we would encourage, that first of all, they have a conversation with the coach. Second of all, if they want to talk to administrator, you need to talk to them. You can't avoid them. You need to talk to them in a very timely manner. And I think the most important thing, and it's one of the skills that we haven't talked that much about, but listening is so important. You have to let them talk. Let them talk so you can figure out what follow-up questions are, and that you really hear what their concerns are. And I would say, before making a return phone call, the thing to do is to go to your coach. If you don't already know, which you may already know, that there's been some issues with that particular student athlete, you need to get the coach's perspective on what they think is going on with the student athlete. And sometimes you don't make progress with that. You try to throw out some solutions, if there are solutions to working with the coach and with the student athlete. I've sat in conversations where the student athlete has asked me to be present with the coach. I've sat in meetings where the parents will not let the student athlete participate, but they'll meet with me and with the coach. Or sometimes they don't even want the coach in the room. And so I think the biggest things you're doing is you're listening, you're gathering all the facts that you can, and then you're trying to make sure that you pull all of them back together at some point with some sort of plan of action of what's going to take place over the next few days, or whether it's over the next season or whatever. But you have to have those conversations, and they can be really, really, very, very, very hard.
Ted, I mean, you have so many programs. Do you get a lot of, demanding parents or adults telling you how it's going to be, or, lawyer talk, or do you face that a lot?
Remarkably, no. I think I want to credit our staff with that for sure. I think there's an emphasis on connection with our community in a way that most people can hopefully resolve these types of issues with the coaches. But I get feedback all the time from our community around how we're doing with that. And I just want to add to Jane's comments a little bit, because I think sometimes when you hear from somebody, one of the things I've learned over the past 18 months is dug pretty deeply into the ladder of inference, where somebody says something and then I jump up right into a story about who they are as people and the story that they're going to tell me. And in difficult conversations with parents, which exist, but not at it's not crazy, Chris. It's not a massive number, but it's constant. It's regular and it's consistent, not constant, consistent, is to just stick with the information that the parent wants to convey and listen to it non-defensively. And the relationship, this is an opportunity for the admin to connect with their staff and just simply get facts and just simply get information and make sure that there's a transparent level of connection between the coaches and the parents, and that circle is closed as quickly as is appropriate. So a parent calls me and says, I have to talk to you immediately. I'm not going to call the coach first. I'm going to call the parent and say, what's up? If a coach comes to me and said, a parent yelled at me and, we didn't have avocado and brie sandwiches at the race and their parents are really mad, I might talk to the coach about their decision-making with regard to that and then reach out to the parents. So there's not a formulaic approach to this, but staying out of the storytelling and the interpretation of what people are saying and really sticking with, like, what are they trying to tell me? And then going from there. And the level of transparency that Jane talked about is massively important to make sure that you don't lose the trust of your people in this process.
And I have two other couple of things. As an administrator, a couple of things. One is I will never talk to a parent about playing time. We've hired coaches to do their job, and they will make all of those decisions. So if the parent would call me and wants to talk about playing time, I refer them back to the coach. The second thing is I will never talk to a parent about another student athlete. As soon as they bring up another student athlete, I'll stop them right there. And I think those are two really important things to back your coaches, to back your other student athletes. If you breach those two things, I think you're going to have bigger problems down the line.
And everything you said is again tied to trust, the relationship that you're building. We're about 6 minutes away from the end of time here, and we go right into the next one. So we knew this was going to happen. Let's talk really quickly about the modern coach, the modern athlete, the paradigm of it all in communicating, because the platforms that the kids are all on, you want to be on to make sure that they get the information about practice or all of that. But there's also some lines that we have to draw, right? There's ways that we're not supposed to, because that's also a gateway to improper behavior. So do we have some, when you're dealing with lines of communication, and they're different to parents and coaches, and, obviously, Nick, you don't want people calling the superintendent, right? At the same time, you don't want your coaches texting one-on-one with 15-year-olds. Anybody want to jump in here and just start? Are there, ways that works well that you have found? Ted or Nick at the high school level, Kevin with the athletes. Anybody have some do's and don'ts about communications that we can start with? Nick, do you have rules of the road?
We do. I'll tell you that they are loosely written. I think we've transformed from, how many years ago where it was uncommon for any students to have a cell phone. Now every single student athlete or student for that matter has a cell phone, right? So we went from, as cell phones become more of a common piece, you saw the use of the Remind app. And I can tell you most of our coaches still use that, mostly because they can control whether or not it's a two-way, a two-way highway for communication. It's an easy way to get messages out to parent groups, student groups. Hey, we have a slight change to practice. It's gonna be a half hour later than originally scheduled. See you then at this location. Bang, it's out there, and they don't need to get the abundance of feedback, that a team might want to share. obviously it's an area where I really lean on the coaches to use their professional judgment, right? I don't check their cell phones. I don't have conversations about, are you texting with a student athlete? It's tough because, right, we talk about coaches meeting student athletes where they are, right? And our student athletes now, that's where they are. They communicate through technology. They communicate behind the cell phone, a skill area that I think, we got to be careful because I think we're finding in young people, the inability to have one-on-one conversations is problematic, right? However, our coaches can't always be in front of their student athletes one-on-one. And, we find often student athletes that want to talk to their coaches about something that's difficult to talk about, but they only feel comfortable doing it, sending it via text message, right? Or via email. So, knock on wood, thankfully, I haven't had any coaches in a short time I've been here where we've run into any kind of issues where they've overstepped. I think our coaches, by and large, are smart about, how they utilize their cell phone and just really trying to limit things. I encourage coaches to not give out their cell numbers to parents. Obviously there's email access. Let's limit it to that. So we don't have hard, fast rules. Our coach's handbook has not been updated soon enough. And again, it's another one of those areas where, shortly here in my time, I have not been able to update it, but that is an area that is not reflected in the coach's handbook about how to communicate with their athletes utilizing technology.
Now, from a rowing perspective, I will say this to everybody listening: Safe Sport has some very definitive rules that you can and cannot do. Whether it's a one-on-one meeting in a closed room, having a third party involved, or the door. I think the quote is it has to be interruptible, like it has to be in a setting where other people can see. So people should know that, in some of the Safe Sport regulations, you can only use emails that come from the organization, not from your personal. So we need to really work on educating ourselves what is appropriate, but not just an opinion, but what some of the rules are. In our sport, we're governed as an Olympic sport by the Safe Sport, which is a federal law. We could go on and on. It's 12:29. I would be remiss not to thank you for your time and your efforts here, panel. You guys are awesome. I think that it's something that should be an ongoing thing. Maybe we'll do that reunion tour that we're talking about. There was one question I wanted to make sure we got out. Ted, are your coaches employees or 1099? That's a big business of rowing question.
That is a big one. All of our staff are hired as CRI at-will employees. There are no contracts and no 1099 jobs. Same
at Saratoga. We found that the New York State laws were, we were playing against in the gray area a little bit, messing around with that. Everybody, thank you so much for joining us. This conversation is just the tip of the iceberg. I look forward to seeing you all. Thank you, everybody who joined us. We have some talks that are going to come on, presentations that are coming right after this. I myself have to switch over to the how to talk to the adolescent brain, how to communicate with the adolescent brain. So I'm pretty excited about that. This was a great, somebody just said it, this was a great kickoff to our convention. So can't thank you guys enough for being here. Take care, everybody. Have a great one. Oh, let me just say this. In the chat, there's a link. If you have questions that you want to ask any of the speakers that didn't get to, feel free. We will make sure that the panelists get those questions and get answers to you. And this recording, this has been a recording, and it will be made available to all of you, as will all of the convention videos for the next 6 months.